Hello. I'd like to talk about the Hasidians. Now, I'm not talking about Hasidim, which is a movement, a Jewish movement of relatively recent years. There's, of course, the medieval Hasidim, Rabbi Shmuel HaChasid, Rabbi Yehuda HaChasid from Ashkenaz, from Germany. This was the 12th or 13th century. And then, of course, there's the 19th century movement that gave rise to the modern Hasidic movement, which is extremely popular and has almost defined orthodoxy in contemporary times. So that's something that is, of course, worthy of discussion, but I want to peel back a few more layers in history and try to determine who the very first Hasidim as a movement, as a philosophy, were. Now, the first thing I should start with is the term as it appears in the Tanakh, in the scripture. Now, in the scripture, of course, there is various references to Hasid. For example, Hoshi'eni Yahweh ki Hasid ani. Save me, God, save me, Yahweh, because I am a Hasid. Right? So, what does that mean? And on this, there is relative consensus that the meaning here is somebody who performs acts of kindness. Okay, the word kindness comes to mind a lot in connection with Chassid. So what do I mean by kindness? Beyond the bounds of obligation. All right. So in ancient times there was the concept of a covenant. There's two parties and they are bound by a certain understanding. You be my patron and I be your protege. Alright, so I pay tribute to you and you protect me. And there's various other sorts of compacts, social agreements between parties. And so a chassid is somebody who does beyond what he's required to do. So with respect to a deity, a chassid is somebody who serves the god beyond what he's required to serve. So that's what the Psalms, the author of the Psalms, whoever that is, that's what he is saying when he's saying Ki Chasid ani, I am a Chasid. Now in English, it is often translated as a pious person. I am a pietist. Okay, so this is an interesting translation, and I've never really done a lot of research on this as to how and why they came up with this term, but I will accept it, and I will refer to the Hasidim in that using this term. Why will I accept it? Because pietist comes from the word pure, and so somebody who is a purist, right, by definition, is going above and beyond what is required, because that's what it means. He's purifying the doctrine, the convention that people are conducting themselves in. In other words, he's saying that there's some misunderstanding, there's some people are not observing it properly, and I want to purify it. Okay, I want to jettison whatever impurities, whatever inappropriate conduct has been accreted to the tradition. Alright, so that's basically what a purist does. And so by definition this is beyond what is required, because by required I mean using the social convention. Right? If nobody else does it, if you're the only group, a small group that does it, then by definition it means that it's beyond what is required. So I'm going to accept this term pietist for Chassid. But I'm spending too much time on this. What I really want to talk about is the Hasidian, the movement of the Hasidians of the 2nd century BC. So let me talk about this. So they are first mentioned in the book of Maccabees. They're mentioned in the book of Maccabees 3 times. They're mentioned in 1 Maccabees twice, and then in 2 Maccabees once. So here is, I'm going to quote you the first time they are mentioned in 1 Maccabees. So the context here is that that Mattathias was fighting the Hellenizers. He was fighting the Syrians, the Seleucids, who were occupying the land, and they were trying to introduce Hellenistic practices and undermining the traditional religious practices. And so it says that so they were fighting the Seleucids, and at one point there was a group that was somehow affiliated with Mattathias, with the Maccabees, and they did not fight on the Sabbath, and they all died. And so this was a rude awakening for the Maccabees, and they decided that from now on, whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him, neither will we die all as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places. Okay, so this is, I just quoted from Maccabees, let's see, 1 Maccabees 2:14. Okay, chapter 2, verse, no, not verse 14, where is it? Verse 42, sorry, verse 42. No, verse 41, sorry, verse 41. Okay, then comes verse 42. Then came there unto him, referring to Mattathias, a company of Hasidians, who were mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. Also, all they that fled for persecution joined themselves unto them, and were a stay unto them. So they joined their forces, and smote sinful men in their anger, and wicked men in their wrath. But the rest fled to the heathen for succor. Then Mattathias and his friends went round about, and pulled down the altars, and what children soever they found within the coast of Israel uncircumcised, those they circumcised valiantly. They pursued also after the proud men, and the work prospered in their land. So they recovered the law out of the hand of the Gentiles and out of the hand of the kings, neither suffered they the sinner to triumph. Okay, so I quoted a little more than I had to, but the most important part is the first verse, which describes who the Hasidians are. They are mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. Now the word "even" in the King James lingo means as well. Simultaneously, while concurrently, they are also that. In other words, they are mighty men of Israel, and they are also voluntarily devoted unto the law. So the first thing, the fact that they're voluntarily devoted unto the law, that we have already internalized. Like, we already understand that, and we accept that as the definition of Hasid. A pietist is one who volunteers to go a step further than what the rest of the society does. But the fact that they were mighty men of Israel is something a little surprising, because we don't think of subsequent Hasidim, right, from the Middle Ages and from the modern movement and such. We don't see them as mighty men. What does this mean, mighty men of Israel? Now, on the surface, it would seem to mean fighters, warriors, right? Mighty men of Israel. In biblical language, a gibor, a mighty man, usually gibor chayil, mighty, valiant, which is also a word that they use later on in the account, valiant. And so these are the terms that they use for fighters. And so the Hasidians were fighters, but we also see that they were disaffected. They were a disaffected bunch. We see that they are also all they that fled for persecution. So this conjures up this image of people who are the have-nots. Okay, they don't have money. Maybe they have become indebted to others. Maybe they can't pay their debts. Maybe they are being persecuted for some other offense that they have committed. Usually because you're poor, right? The rich people, somehow they don't commit any offenses. So we get this notion that they are disaffected, disenfranchised. They feel that they're not getting a fair share of society, and they're just suffering under the yoke of the ruling class. And so this is another interesting idea of who the Hasidim are. But here's the defining thing that we see throughout, which is, and this is all scholars agree upon, that the Hasidians were anti-Hellenistic. So this is very clear. And okay, so this is the first reference to the Hasidim, to the Hasideans, and then let's see the second reference in the book of Maccabees. Let's see. Okay, so here this is the story of Alchemist. So Alchemist was a priest, the name of a high priest, and he was installed by Bacchides, who was a Syrian general, and in the 60s, in the 160s BC. So Bacchides came, and he sort of, inflicted some heavy blows on the Maccabees, and in those years, after 161, the Maccabean revolt was sort of in remission. It wasn't very vigorous, and they survived, of course, and they came back with a vengeance after a decade. But for the decade of 160 to 151, until they were officially recognized by the Seleucids in 151, so for that decade they were quiet. And Alchemist was a high priest during that decade. And Alchemist was of priestly lineage, okay, so which is an improvement over his predecessor Menelaus, who was not of priestly lineage, and which might have been a big reason for the Maccabean revolt in the first place, okay, because this was such an outrageous thing to do. But anyway, this Alchemist was no saint either. We can imagine a significant Hellenizer, maybe not as far as Menelaus, but he was Hellenized to a great degree. And here's the other thing. So Alchemist, according to the account of 1 Maccabees, the Hasidians were the first among the children of Israel that sought peace of them. So the Hasidians came to him, to Alchemist, and they wanted to make peace. Because the Hasidians, remember, from the earlier reference, the Hasidians, originally they were with Judah Maccabee, and they were fighting the Seleucids. So since Alchemist was an ally of the Seleucids, and he was in fact installed as high priest by them, so the Hasidians came to him and they wanted to make peace. And, so I continue. For said they, one that is a priest of the seed of Aaron is come with this army, and he will do us no wrong. So he spake unto them peaceably, and sware unto them, saying, We will procure the harm neither of you nor your friends. Whereupon they believed him. Howbeit, he took of them 70 men, and slew them in one day, according to the words which he wrote. The flesh of thy saints have they cast out, and their blood have they shed round about Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them. Wherefore the fear and dread of them fell upon all the people, who said, There is neither truth nor righteousness in them, for they have broken the covenant and oath that they made. So what he's saying here is that he actually betrayed them. He called them up, and he told them, let's make peace, let's sign a truce, but instead he actually killed them. So the reason he did it is because he wanted to show the population, hey, don't mess with me, just accept me, and it's not going to wind up well if you try to resist me. And so this was a common tactic in ancient times to achieve the loyalty of the population. You showed cruelty, and cruelty actually worked. So that's why he did it. But what we see from this, though, is the important element of this little episode here is that the Hasidians wanted peace. So the question here is, it seems that the Hasidians wanted peace, but not the Maccabees, right? So that's a little bit still up in the air here. We don't understand whether it's all of them, whether the Hasidians is highly integrated with the Maccabean revolt in general, or it's a separate group. And the other thing we don't know is whether they actually made peace or not. And I think many scholars presume that peace was secured ultimately, but from me, the way it seems to me is that peace was not secured at all because they were betrayed. So even though they may have considered peace, but after this incident, I think it seems that it was off the table. So I'm not sure about this. But we do see from this that the Hasidians, if this account is true, that the Hasidians at least sued for peace, they wanted peace, and which could be fairly telling as to what their philosophy was. Their philosophy might have been anti-Hellenistic, but not necessarily pro-militarism. Like, they didn't want to fight the Hellenists. They didn't necessarily mind them being in a political position of power, as long as you culturally laid your hands off the, things. Okay, so you didn't try to interfere in cultural matters. So yeah, like don't build a gymnasium, don't build a whatever the other institutions were, the Ephebia and stuff like that. Okay, Lyceum, isn't that what it's called? Something like that. So that's the second reference, and then let me see. The third reference is in 2 Maccabees, and it says that those of the Jews that he called Hasideans, whose captain is Judas Maccabeus, nourish war and are seditious, and will not let the rest be in peace. Therefore, I, being deprived of mine ancestors' honor, I mean the high priesthood, am now come hither first, verily for the unfreighted care. Okay, blah blah blah. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point here is that it sees here, that in 2 Maccabees it refers to the Hasidians as under the hegemony, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, and they are nourishing war. Okay, so this is proof that the peace had not succeeded, was not concluded successfully in the previous event. Okay, so the Hasidians are still, again, like some scholars see this as a contradiction, and they try to reconcile the two, but I don't think it's a contradiction, because they sought peace, but they didn't get it, because they were betrayed. And so now, naturally, you will see the Hasidians still in the camp of the Maccabees, and fighting the Seleucids and the Jewish Hellenizers. Okay, so that's the story with the Hasidians. Now, oh my God, I'm talking 17 minutes now. Okay, so let me wrap this up. So the Hasidians were anti-Hellenistic. That is pretty clear. They were militaristic to some extent, but they may have sought peace at some point. And so the question is, what became of them? So let's look at before we answer this question, let's look at some other sources that shed some light on the evolution and the development and the evolution of the Hasidians. Now, by the way, let me just explain the term Hasidians. Now, it's spelled Assideans. There is no H at the beginning. That's because it is a Greek word. And in Greek, of course, there is no H. There is an eta, and which is pronounced like an E, right? That there's no H, and there is also no ch sound or h sound in Greek. So the spelling is Hasidians, but there's no doubt, there's no question that the book of Maccabees, even though it was written in Greek, it refers to the Hasidim. Now, okay, so now let me resume and try to talk about some of the references in the rabbinic literature. So in the rabbinic literature, we have in the Mishnah in Avot, we have Yosei ben Yoezer. Okay, Yosei ben Yoezer, he is called it says in the Mishnah, Hu haya Hasid shebakahuna. He was the pietist within priesthood. Okay, so he was the most pious one in the priesthood. And Hoita mitpachto midras lakodesh. His scarf had a certain level of ritual purity, whatever. Okay, not relevant to us at this point. But the point is that he was Hasid. And here the connotation seems to be that he conducted himself beyond the obligations that a priest had in terms of ritual purity. Okay, so this is important. This actually reinforces the general definition of chassid, which is somebody who is volunteers to observe the law beyond the requirement. And but the reason why I am talking about him, there's various other references of chassid in the Mishnah and Talmud. The reason this is most important is because it's actually the first one. The first one in terms of time. Okay, temporally speaking, Yosei ben Yoezer was the oldest in the chain of transmission. So if you look at the Mishnah and Avot, Yosei ben Yoezer is like he is. I mean, I don't know exactly, but he's 1 or 2 generations after Shimon. What do they call him? Shimon HaKohen, right? Shimon HaKohen. Hoya Mishyare Knesset Agdola. Okay, so he's like 1 or 2 generations afterwards. So he's and Yosei HaKohen. We're talking here the 160s BC, and he's of course even before we are aware of the Pharisee movement. The Pharisee movement comes after Yosei ben Yoezer. So the first prominent Pharisee was Shimon ben Shetach. And Shimon ben Shetach is 2 generations after him. There's Yosei ben Yoezer. I think there's Yeshua ben Parachia. He's the one who had to flee the land of Israel due to persecution, due to the Pharisaic persecution under Alexander Yanai. And then he returned along with Shimon ben Shetach, and they revived Phariseeism, of course, under Salome Alexandra. She legalized, so to speak, Phariseeism, and that was the beginning of the movement. Yes. So Yosef ben Yoezer, as a chassid, he predates the advent of Phariseeism. This is very important. And it is important because it would seem that Phariseeism would have drawn some inspiration from the Hasidic movement, from the Hasidean movement. Okay, let's distinguish between this and subsequent movements. So Phariseeism would have drawn some inspiration, some major inspiration from the Hasidean movement, because we see many points of similarity between the two. So let's see. I'm going to look at some of the rabbinic literature, some of the Talmudic literature about Hasidim. So here's what we know. There are various references in the Talmud. Maaseh b'chasid echad shahaya blah blah blah. A chassid who did this, a chassid who did that. Now let me preface this by saying that there is no question that, and there's no question, but it is highly plausible that when the Talmud says Maaseh b'chasid echad, they're not referring to somebody who belongs to a larger movement. It's an individual on a personal level. They are calling them a chassid, a pietist. And the actual story is proof that it is on an individual level, because invariably the following story recounts and paints a picture of somebody who is doing something very devoted to God, something that is beyond what the average person would do. And so it's not a movement, it's just rather a personal act of piety. So here's what we see. We see acts of piety in reference to ta'anit, okay, fasting, prishut from a woman, perash min ha'isha, you see that, Maaseh b'chasid echad. There's a story about somebody who's how do you say, nifritza lo paratz b'tzoch sadehu. There was a breach in his field, and it would have amounted to a large cataclysmic monetary damage, and he refrained from fixing it on the Sabbath nonetheless. So, and then there's another one, a story about tefillah, about prayer, and then another one, nasan dinar la'ani, somebody who gave charity to a poor man. And most of these practices seem to have been very important to the subsequent Pharisaic movement. Like, for example, tefillah. There's no question, and this is well documented and well attested, that the Pharisees put a great emphasis on prayer. and also the observance of the Sabbath. And I mean, we see this from the New Testament, for example. This is one of the points of contention between the Pharisees and Jesus. How meticulously one is obliged to observe the Sabbath, and same thing is prishut min ha'isha, separation from women, from menstruating women and women in general. So we see for another thing attested by the New Testament, we see the story about a woman anointing Jesus' foot, and the Pharisees were not happy with that. And Ta'anit, same thing. This is one of the famous criticisms of Jesus against the Pharisees. So they show off, like whenever they're fasting, they show off. They make it very obvious. Hey, look at me. And he didn't take kindly to that. So we know that these things that the Talmud says that the Hasidim did, the Pharisees also did. Interesting. So the question is there any connection between the Hasidim of the Talmud and the earlier Hasidic movement? In other words, is it possible that the earlier Hasidic movement already laid the groundwork for these acts of piety, and which were not taken up by the population at large, but however, in subsequent centuries, they were taken up by some people whom the rabbinic movement calls Hasidim. Okay, as in an allusion to the earlier Hasidim, hence the term Hasidim Harishonim, which might mean the former Hasidim, the Hasidim that are no longer with us, right? And so maybe that's the explanation for this. Okay, I've been talking for a long time, so I'm just going to leave it here. I have a lot more to say, but just going to let it go.